All right, the story today is called Garden Stories, and it's by Kevin Sanji, and it's illustrated by Kristen Sora. And before we get started, I want to explain that this story is a little different than what we're used to because it is like two stories in one. So, this story is going to be realistic fiction where the people and the places seem real and the characters are doing things that could be real and all the events are happening, could happen in real life. But it also has a short story in it that is a fable. And a fable is a short story. It only has a couple of characters, one, two or three. The characters are usually animals or things that talk and act like people, and it teaches a lesson or a moral in it. And when you see the short story parts, the fable parts, they will be in italic print. Now, italic print is kind of like when the letters are slanted. We saw it back when we read Abuelito's Lap, and the Spanish words were in italics. And authors do that because they are drawing special attention to what's being said in the story with that italics. So when it happens, make sure I point it out to you. The essential question is, what might you find in a garden? And we will be using the comprehension strategies, asking and answering questions. So that helps us think about things as we read. And we'll also be using clarifying, where we go back and we try to understand something that's happened in the story that may be confusing the first time we read it. So let's go ahead and get started with garden stories. Mr. Mendez's class took a trip to the botanical garden. Botanical gardens contain many different types of plants. The plants can be outdoors or kept inside. So after I read this page, I wonder what kind of plants are in a botanical garden. You think the class will see trees or flowers or other kinds of plants? Do you have any questions about what they might see? The guide, Miss Gloria, led the children into the botanical garden. She was a botanist and knew all about plants. Now, here's the word botanist. And when I come across an unknown word, it's important to stop and figure out what it means. So, what does botanical and botanical gardens mean? What can be found in this garden? So, I think since it's a botanical garden, contains plants, that maybe a botanist is someone who is a scientist that studies plants. As Miss Gloria welcomed the class, she smiled. I am so happy you are here today. I like to teach facts about plants. I also like to tell fables, which are stories that teach us lessons. Aesop wrote many fables a long time ago. Follow me, said Miss Gloria. She led the class to the big fir trees. Fir trees can be found in many places. Maybe you have seen one in a park. They stay green all year. They grow best in the mountains with lots of sunlight. Now, Miss Gloria is telling the class about fir trees here on page 10, and she says they stay green all year. So, do you see those fir trees in the illustration there? Have you ever seen a fir tree yourself? If you have ever had a live Christmas tree, then you've seen a fir tree. Fir trees need lots of rain too. Fir trees grow quickly. They make good homes for birds and other animals because they stay green all year. Let me tell you a story about a big fir tree, said Miss Gloria. All right, so here's where the print looks a little bit different. It's slanted. This is our italic print that I was talking about. Once there was a big, beautiful fir tree. Its neighbor was a prickly bramble bush. The fir tree was tall and strong. The bramble bush was brown and messy. The fir tree bragged, people love me. They use my strong wood to make houses and furniture. Bramble bush, you are useless, and no one cares about you. Just then, a man came by and cut down the beautiful fir tree. He wanted to use the wood to build his home. The bramble bush watched sadly. Oh, dear fir tree, said the bramble bush, it is better to be simple and happy than fancy and used up. Reggie raised his hand. "It's not nice to brag," he said. "It's not right to call someone useless," said Maria. Miss Gloria agreed. "You're both right. You understand the lesson in the fable," she said. "Let's move over to the wetland area," said Miss Gloria. "This is an area of land where the ground is wet and sometimes underwater. We built a pond to create our very own wetland here in the botanical garden." So she told them a fable, and they said that the lesson they learned from the fable, because remember, fables teach lessons, is not nice to brag, and it's not right to call someone names like useless. "Look at all the tall grasses," said Miss Gloria. "They are called reeds. Reeds are tall plants. They look like very tall grass. They can reach 16 feet high. Since they grow in the wetlands, they get plenty of water. I have another story for you. This one is about reeds," she exclaimed. All right, so when you look at page 17, you can see it's in italics again. See how the print on page 17 looks different than on page 16? Some reeds lived along a river. A big oak tree grew nearby. The oak tree was over 200 years old. The oak tree looked much stronger than the reeds. One day, a strong wind blew and blew. The mighty wind was so strong that it blew down the big oak tree. The oak tree spoke sadly to the reeds. "You look weak, but you are still standing. I am strong, but I fell. Why?" The reeds replied, "We are safe because we can bend and move. It is better to bend than to break." All right. So, is anyone else a little confused about what the reeds look like? If you look at this page, you might be able to tell a little more. See how it looks like the tall grass is growing right out of the water, and they're not straight up; they're kind of bent over. So as we read this next page, I want to stop and clarify the moral of this lesson. The moral is the very last sentence on that page. It is better to bend than to break. So, because the reeds could bend, they were able to sway in the wind. And because the oak tree was so rigid, it blew over. And that kind of goes with people. It's better to be flexible and to have patience and those kinds of things than it is to be rigid and to break. The class grew quiet and thoughtful. Lily's hand popped up. "I don't get it," Miss Gloria said. "Lily, Aesop is saying that sometimes the biggest are not always the strongest," replied Miss Gloria. All right, class, let's look at another exhibit. How many of you have heard of olives? Asked Miss Gloria. Almost everyone in the class raised their hands. Olives are fruit that grow on olive trees. Olive trees grow best in soil. They need water and a lot of sun, Miss Gloria explained. Flowers will bloom on the trees in the spring. The olives appear green in late summer, said Miss Gloria. Olive trees are evergreens, so they should not lose their leaves. Now, how about one last story? Miss Gloria smiled. Okay, again, notice the italic print of the story. There was once a beautiful green olive tree. The olive tree teased the nearby fig tree because while the olive tree was green all year, the fig tree's leaves changed with the seasons and fell off for the winter. One windy day, snow began to fall. The snow settled on the leaves of the olive tree and became very heavy. The branches became so heavy from the snow that they broke. The olive tree was robbed of its beauty, but because the fig tree had no leaves, the snow fell to the ground and did not harm the fig tree at all. So here's a good time to stop and clarify, because I don't know if anybody else is confused about what happens in this fable. So let's think about what makes the olive tree beautiful, like it stays green all year. But what happens to the olive tree in the story? Because it stayed green all year and kept its leaves, the snow was able to pile onto the tree and its branches broke. So, how do you think those broken branches affected that tree's beauty? Probably not as beautiful as it once was with all of those broken branches. The class was quiet again. First, Mr. Mendez asked, "Who can tell us the lesson in this story?" Then he looked at his watch and exclaimed, "Oh, we need to go." Now, is anyone else wondering why Mr. Mendez says that they have to go and he can't finish talking about the lesson in the fable? I mean, maybe they have to be back to school at a certain time because school's going to get out. So he says we have to go. The children got back on the bus. "When can we go back to the botanical garden?" Thomas asked. "I want to learn more about the plants and hear more stories from Miss Gloria." "Not for a while," said Mr. Mendez, "but we can go to the library and get books about plants." "And Aesop's fables," said Maria. All right. That is the end of our story. But before you go, let's talk about some vocabulary here. We've got to go all the way back. There we go. There's the first one that I want to talk about. It said, "I also like to tell fables, which are stories that teach us lessons."
Lessons. Plural form of lesson. Something learned, taught, or studied.
All right, lessons are something that are learned or taught or studied. So the lessons that you learn in a fable is something that it teaches you about life. All right, let's look for our next vocabulary word. They are in yellow. There it is. This is the word bramble. Its neighbor was a prickly bramble bush.
Bramble. Bush with thorns. Carrie was scratched by the bramble. The bush's thorns were sharp.
All right, so a bramble bush has sticky thorns on it because a bramble bush is a bush with thorns. Let's find our next vocabulary word. There it is. It's the word wetland. And she says, let's move over to the wetland area.
Wetlands.
All right, so wetland is exactly what it sounds like. Wetland is exactly what it is. So the land is wet there, so certain kinds of plants and animals would live there. One more vocabulary one more vocabulary word, and it's the word reeds. They are called reeds, and they're talking about reeds that are the tall plants.
Reeds. Plural form of reed. A certain type of tall grass that usually grows in wet areas. Tall reeds grow by the pond.
Right, so we're talking about those reeds, those plants that grow in a wetland area, right? All right, so we'll talk more about this story tomorrow, and I will be sure to include the discussion starters so that you can talk about all the things that happen in our story. There's a lot of things that happen. There are the story about the kids on a field trip, and there's also the stories within the stories, the fables that Miss Gloria tells.